Hello, everyone, and welcome to Copenhagen. This will be one of my last shows here in Copenhagen, and wanted to get this good friend of mine, Erik Paisley, with me today, who is an anthropologist. We've been having a great chat before we came on air, which is why it took such a long time to get on air. But tell us a little bit about what we've been talking about. So we're talking about anthropology. Tell us what anthropology is.
Well, basically, anthropology is the comparative study of human culture. So historically, anthropologists go out and study remote tribes, social groups, smaller sort of undocumented peoples, and get an idea of what's going on with them and what their life is about, what their values are, what their social systems are, and we publish that in ethnographies.
Ethnography. So the title of today's show is Deep, Deep Hangout.
Yes.
Deep, deep hangout in Bitcoin, because also you're really into cryptocurrency.
Yes.
And that is just a cesspit of trolling. I want us to talk about trolling.
Yeah.
So tell me what trolling is.
I mean, trolling is just, poking fun at people, pulling their leg, pulling their chain, yanking about. It's sort of, the best, I think the best thing that you can compare it to is like bathroom graffiti, which has an amazing term in anthropology or sociology, which is latrinalia. And it's the sort of thing that people write when they're behind the screen and you can't see them, and they have a laugh with it. I think some trolls can be extremely vicious, but generally, I have a secret sweet spot for them.
Why is that?
Because I mean, they make sort of off-the-cuff remarks. They don't filter. I mean, of course, they don't filter at all, and they can give you an idea of sort of what are the rumors that are going on, what are the suspicions that people have, what are people being called out on. And I think it's sort of basically, it's quite a strong reflection of negative values in a community, what they troll and bicker and pass rumors about.
But so you've been doing so ethnography, otherwise known as deep, deep hanging out in the lingo, and that is the role of an anthropologist, not so much a sociologist, or is it?
I mean, there are sociologists like urban sociologists and family sociologists who spend time in domestic settings, but no, traditionally this is the sort of thing that we do. We're on site.
That's right. And actually, we now have this kind of peer-to-peer ethnography, because we can now deep hang out in these internet forums, which are replete with these pseudo-anonymous, there's a sort of front-side anonymity that they get because the webmaster, whoever, probably knows a little bit about them. Yeah. But all we see is like an avatar. And Christopher Poole often talks about that the anonymity is authenticity, that if you don't have the ability to wear a mask, you can't really be yourself. Similar, Shakespeare had a very good quote about that too. Does that ring true for you or not?
I think that in anthropology, we're sort of uncomfortable with authenticity. We're not against it, but the thing is that, I said it right before, that it gives you sort of a different unfiltered access when you see trolls and people using monikers online. But are people being more authentic? I don't think that they wouldn't behave the way that they behave on the internet in real life.
Right.
But could you say, like, is someone more real towards their mother than they are towards their friends in the city?
So it's both and.
It's exactly. Yeah. It's just a different side of people, and it's different rules. And I think maybe the rules are less structured, and I think the rules are like on an internet forum or in a chat forum. I think maybe the rules are more to the user's liking than. They're more directly shaped by these users in particular, and not by sort of more general social conventions. So in that sense, you might call them more authentic.
But what you don't have,
more customized.
One of the interesting things, one of the books that I'm kind of reading and promoting at the moment, not getting paid to promote it, but this is one of my favorite authors, genuinely, called Robert Harrison. He's the professor of French and Italian at Stanford University, and he's got a great show called Entitled Opinions, which airs on KCSU, which is the local radio station, but you can download on the internet at various sort of podcasting websites. And one of the interesting things that comes up in this book is this notion that before, thinking about the classic sort of noble savage, that before we became civilized and started cleaning ourselves and all these kind of administrivia, techniques that we have for locking people, Harrison notes that if you got into a beef with someone in the forest, well, first of all, that the forest gives us somewhere to hide. It gives us somewhere to go. That there's a sort of a metaphorical darkness inside of the forest that gives the ability to turn, to change. That when you're going through the forest, you can do nothing but think, because that's all you're really left to. You're left to your mind. And so when we start to think, we start to imagine, we start to become teleological. We start to conceive of futures, and then this capacity to bring them into the present. Now, when you come up against an adversary in the forest, and before you become socialized and you have things like agriculture, he says, look, as long as you've got the capacity to run away, you're untethered. You could just run away from someone who's got a problem with you. One of the features of society itself is this kind of accountability structure that you have. You have a name, you have an address, you are traceable, fixable. And this is one of the things that comes up all the time in the debate in Bitcoin, is this ability to be able to tether every single transaction, every single action of what Hannah Arendt called the who, to the self, the private self, the only person that you can be with as yourself. And this is something that comes along in ancient times, and I'm thinking about Mesopotamia, and we talked yesterday a little bit about Gilgamesh, which is the oldest text, which you haven't read. You should be Googling that right now. And one of the interesting features of the internet is it does allow for both and. You can both be social and be on these forums, and at the same time be untethered, to be able to run away from your actions. So the who of the action can take place in a public forum that can be co-witnessed, co-understood by lots of different people, and at the same time you can leave.
Well, I think, you know, this is really well documented for different social spaces. If you look at like the work of James C. Scott, I mentioned before, he's a historian actually, but he writes anthropology about Southeast Asia and about sort of ungoverned zones and territories called zomia, he calls it. And these are spaces where people could withdraw to. So you'll have like a central state, or you'll have really organized agriculture, sort of society building, what to us looks like more advanced societies, in like the Riverdales and in the flat areas. And of course, they would also have things like diseases, and they would have conscription, they would have taxes, and they would have sort of a social structure that's a fairly governed space and a very knowable space. And so you see people withdrawing into the hills and into forests, of course, and into swamps in the US, to remote islands in the Caribbean. And there are a lot of these ungoverned zones. And well, they're very creative. I mean, it's not like people, you know, people don't revert to being savages to the extent that we were ever truly savages. They just have, well, different social structures out there, very egalitarian, which isn't all sweet. It's not all sweetness and light, because it's fairly harshly enforced. But we do find that, and some of them have given up literacy. There's like you'll find stories of them tossing away their books and changing the names of their tribes just to be less knowable.
So this is like the Riboletha in Christianity and tabula rasa, the idea of wiping the slate clean that we've in the debt jubilee. And then,
yeah, of course. I mean, that's probably one of the reasons that people would escape out there. I mean, most slaves historically would have been, for instance, debt slaves, or they would have been prisoners of war. And the best way to do that is not to, you know, do a Spartacus and rebel. It's much, much easier to do the grassroots thing and just escape into the wild, become a maroon.
Like Zarathustra maybe, and have an epiphany, and then come down to the marketplace.
But even just basic low-class people, or people who are even illiterate, people who could have been captured a while away. I don't think they would have been, many of them would have been scholars or, you know, Buddhists or anything. They were probably, many of them were just trying to, like, you know, build a life for themselves.
Okay, so then this leads into the other idea. Who wrote the book Protocol? Do you remember that guy?
No.
I can't remember it. Anyway, it'll come to me in a minute. I'm on a brain bad day. There was this notion that comes up, and it's a great word called protocol, just protocol. If you look it up, it's on PDF on all over the internet. And one of the things that comes up early on in the thesis is this idea that networks are post hoc rationalized, that we don't know the network until we see the whole network. So it really is a case of perspective, that once, in order to conceive of a network, we first have to have an understanding of all the nodes. We have to be able to map it out, that the terrain is mappable. And what is this ability? Is there a connection between our ability to form mental images in our mind of quite complex structures such that we can make accurate predictions about the future? This is science. This is what science and the Hellenists were all about. It was about, you know, forming a hypothesis, attempting to prove or disprove that hypothesis through a series of controlled measures in a way that anyone can verify independently. And that would made it a markedly different style of storytelling to religion, where this was a paternalistic, like, I hand this down to you, everything you need to know is in this book. And by the time you get to Descartes, you know, between Aristotle and the Bible, that's it. That is your internet, right? You pretty much got everything right there that you need to go to in case that you've got questions. And one of the things that strikes me about cryptocurrency, because I want to listen to you talk a little bit about the blockchain. You said some great insights came out yesterday. I'd love you to share that with our audience. Is that now you've got this structure that gives people an independent mode of reference. That, like science, if you can prove that the boiling point of water is, 100 degrees centigrade, I can perform the same experiment with the same variables in my location and independently verify it for myself. I keep going on about Copernicus, thought experiment, because really what he gave to the world was a thought experiment. He said, like, imagine you're on the sun looking back at the earth in the heliocentric position. What does it look like? Oh, it looks like the same thing. And if everyone performs this thought experiment with me, no one's going to disagree. Just like if everyone understands certain protocols on the internet, you know, SMTP and HTTP, and now with Bitcoin's blockchain, once everyone understands the protocol, we can all understand that this is an independent tool. I don't have to take your word for it that the transaction went through. I can have an exchange with anyone in the world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that ties into sort of more generally mappability and literacy. Literacy would have been very strictly guarded before. And that means that you can control these kind of flows. That means that you have the power to define what's in the laws, what the universe looks like if you're an essential power. I mean, we know that, for instance, the plebeians and the patricians in Rome, one of the early landmarks that the plebeians got was that they got access to the law. The law was publicized.
Right.
In Denmark, we had an absolutist constitution in the early 16th, 17th century, and it wasn't actually publicized until about 40 years after it had been into effect. So I mean, you see that a lot. And when everything from literacy to general more knowledge of science and so on spreads, these things become more difficult to maintain. But I don't think we should be naive about it either. I mean, there's lots of people defining opinions today. There's lots of thought leaders. There's lots of legislation out there. Governance structures. So I mean, we're not going to see like a dissolution, I think, of radical egalitarian social order. I don't.
I suppose what I'm trying to learn about is like, what makes us want to impose order on another group of people in the first place? What is that will to power? Like, I have an idea and I have an epiphany, and I have a celebration of my perspective. Let's say I have an insight, and then I want other people to see this insight. And actually, for me, when I've worked on various companies, one of the things I try to get if I work for a startup, for example, one of the first things I'll show you is how to prioritize tasks. And the reason I do that is because I think that's the raison d'etre of a startup. You're replete with ideas. Everyone's got an opinion on what you should be working on next. And the real value in a startup is to work out what should be worked on next in a way that everyone can settle on. And the reason I do that is because everyone is a rock star now. Everyone's a god. Everyone has the ability to own the means of their own production. These laptops and these phones now give us the ability to be writers, journalists, and photographers, and programmers, and all God knows what else. And now with Bitcoin, of course, we can be our own bankers if we want to. We can set up our own ledgers and our own social contracts. And as a result, it gives us this almost, I would say, if we're not careful, distributed tyranny, where actually tyranny, in my opinion, is a way of being. It's an attitude, it's an approach. And I think it begins with fear. I think it's a motivation, but that basically gives one license to control another human being, right? To impose one's will on another because I'm right and everything I say is right. Does that make sense?
Well, if you're looking at it from a knowledge perspective, I think that the kind of dominion that you're looking at here, that kind of tyranny, is very much about legibility. It's about like, why would you want to go out and map out a distant town? Why would you want to go out and build a population registry? Why would you want to standardize people's names and so on and so on? It's not, these are not simple tools. If I go back to James C. Scott, who I think is one of the most brilliant thinkers that we've got, he writes about this a lot. He writes about Seeing Like a State, which is an amazing book that describes everything from cartography to cadastral maps and so on. And of course, they're tools for governance. That's what they are. And are we ever gonna? I think that introducing legibility onto other people is extremely fundamental. And fear is a part of it, because you want to understand what's going on with other people, and you want to know where you can categorize them. And let's say if your category doesn't fit, you can move the person into the category, or you can adjust the category. And often it's easier to just keep the category because we've defined that, and just pigeonhole the person.
It also requires a sort of a negotiation with the ego, and to reconcile the fact that I might have been wrong about this.
Yeah, we don't like that. cognitive dissonance is deeply uncomfortable.
And sunk cost, you know, in economics and in particularly investors in the startup world, I see this sunk cost problem all the time, where well, miners, Bitcoin miners, right? A lot of my friends got into Bitcoin mining. I told them not to do it. I said, look, this is a zero-sum game. I'll show you the code where it specifies the zero-sum nature of it. It's not designed for you to be massively profitable. This isn't a money printing scheme. And once the mining became unprofitable, you know what they did? They kept mining because they weren't able to negotiate themselves into a position where they were okay having made a bad decision. They would rather lose money and act in this very irrational way and keep losing money because they're not ready to admit that they have made a bad investment decision.
I think discomfort is a cost in itself. It's not about just financial accounting. I think maybe that's like one thing that where anthropology or psychology can add a little bit to looking at business decisions. That why do people do these things that are ostensibly irrational?
Yeah.
Well, they're not. It's not a very good business model to protect your sunk costs. But discomfort is a cost of its own. People do not like to have to backtrack. They do not like having to change things that they've been going about, because a lot of work goes into building these things.
Yeah.
I mean, like even fundamentals. I mean, things like things like social gender, nationality, social roles. I mean, even things that we would consider rather fundamental, they take a lot of work to maintain. I mean, you have to go out, you have to keep up appearances, you have to work on it, you have to show yourself as being a part of this role, and so on and so on. And since you put the time into investing in the system, you're not going to. I mean, you're going to be loath, basically, to disregard it. And maybe, I don't know if I'm not a startup expert in any way, but if I could imagine that, whatever pet project somebody has, they're going to be pretty protective of that project. I would imagine that.
I mean, I'm guilty of it. I know many of my friends waste, upwards of 2-3 years of their lives working on an idea that just, I'm sorry, mate, but you've got to stop this. It's not going anywhere. You're not getting any uses.
I still have a blog for that reason.
Well, no, this is the thing. It's like I say, it's a celebration of one's perspective that you're not willing to let go. And one of my heroes in the space is Mike Cohn. He's got a background in agile development, and actually one of the best thinkers, I think, since then is all the stuff on lean startup movements. So Erik Ries and Estelle. Although I think he's rather he's more entertainment than he is education, but I certainly think that the message that he's putting out there is a good one, which is validated learning. That you say, okay, as a user, I want this feature and I want it to do all these kind of things, but then you test it and you don't keep working on it if it keeps failing the test, right? You face up, like, one of the best questions you can ask someone, if you've got an idea for a startup, and so many people do, crowdfunding is all the rage these days. If you've got a startup, one of the best questions you can ask your potential customer is, how much would you care if this thing didn't exist, on a scale of 1 to 10? Just tell me now, because if you're not going to use it, I want to know. I don't want to spend 50 grand building a prototype and then going around to see these VCs if this thing isn't going to work. So you've got the sunk cost fallacy, but I want to bring this back to identity and the ledger, and I want to read, before we do, I want to get a good definition of what laws are. Rules that can be enforced. Umberto Eco talks about the list, this idea that civilization often begins with lists of things, lists of rules. And Ilex, I mean, here's the quote from Giambattista Vico. So when it comes to the word law, lex, Vico writes, first it must have meant a collection of acorns. Thence we believed it derived from ilex, as it were, ilex, the oak. And for the oak, it produces acorns by which the swine are drawn together. Lex was next a collection of vegetables, from which latter they could be called a laguna. And then later on, the time and the vulgar letters had yet to be invented and writing down. So essentially, we're looking at a picture where the law is a gathering. It's a bringing together of scatteredness. And also Harrison has this other wonderful insight in some of his other work, where he says that every language must have a dead language at its core. That in order to have a new language, there must be a prior kind of mythos of storytelling, like thinking of the Homeric and so on, where you've got a mythos that gives rise to a logos, a logic. And that's where we get the word leg from, logos, and that's where this notion of gathering. So we have this gathering, maybe of mental images, thoughts, which I think, and it's been running throughout my shows and my philosophy, is that I think thought features so much more in our lives than we even admit to, than thoughts and speech. And we tend just to focus on things out there, things in space. We tend to focus on stuff we can see that's outside of our mind, rather than searching inwards and then going outwards and then going inwards again. Right? There isn't this kind of process. So now, when it comes to the trolls on all the exchanges, and we pulled up the infamous BTC-E troll box, of which I was a veteran once a couple of years ago. I used to spend most of my time on there. I wasn't trading. I was actually just socializing. It felt like a nice place to be, because you had all these interesting, diverse groups of people that were coming together. And I think without realizing it, BTC-E, far from being ethnographers or sociologists, were just trying to make, a business. And they realized that one of the best features on the website was this chat room next to the graph. In sociology, you have this notion of the social object and object-centered sociality more generally, where you can have like a football stadium or a church. You're not just tied to your family and friends that you grew up with. You're also tied based on what Facebook called the interest graph, right? All the things you're interested in, the preferences that you have, which is what markets are about. People trying to get their preferences met and trying to get something that someone else have at a price that you're willing to settle for. And so when you look at this troll box, what I notice is, now I assume that BTC put it in there because it makes sense for their profit, right? I'm assuming that,
attracts attention.
Yeah. And also that you're about to approach a decision, and they need you to make lots and lots of decisions, because if you don't make decisions, you don't trade. And if you don't trade, they don't get their fees. So they need you to keep playing. This is a game. They make their fees no matter whether the price goes up or down, as long as they manage their funds properly. So the chat room was there, and people would be like, yeah, TRC is going up. Yeah. Or this is about to pump in 10 minutes. What's the pump? They come in. First thing you'd say, what's the pump? Okay, name coin. And they'd look at the chart and they'd look back. And what they're looking for, I noticed as I was deep hanging out there, they're looking for excuses. I need to make a decision. I need to be excused. As I approach this decision, it's almost like the decision process itself goes like this. And you're the expert, not me, but this is how it came across. Was that you start with this process of information gathering. I'm learning, and I'm talking to people, and I'm listening to their decisions, and I'm working stuff out. And then instantly you go into post hoc rationalization. You've now got a memory of making the trade. And you've made the trade, and now you need to decide whether or not it was a good decision, or whether or not you need to change. Now, what I noticed happen was they would make the trade if they thought that they could excuse themselves in the future. So they wouldn't commit to the action until they thought they had enough evidence to recuse themselves and say, no, that was a good decision because that guy told me to. But what this led to was a negative feedback loop, where actually, the last thing you want to be doing in the market is listening to people. You trust what you see, not what you hear, because nobody in there was your friend. Right? Everyone in there wanted you to commit to an action that favored them. So if they had bought a stock already or bought a coin already, they needed you to buy it to make the price go up. And they had sell orders in place. They would have stock puppet accounts. The whole thing was just a Nash nightmare. Sort of the game theorists would have an absolute field day in there. It would have been absolutely delightful for them. And I'm wondering about what these forums do, how these forums fit into a blockchain where the ELEX, where the lexicon is actually fairly, if you've got the time and the patience for it, easy to understand once you apply yourself. Certainly you don't have to jump through a lot of hoops. You need a computer, an internet connection, and a little bit of willpower. And then you can go online, you can learn it for yourself. You can download your own copy of the blockchain. And now you've got a local copy. Now, if that blockchain was hosted somewhere else and you came back and you were like, right, I need to check that transaction, how are you expected to remember everything that takes place?
Well, and there's no way to do that
unless you've got a local copy.
Exactly. There's I think there's on that, just distinguish, if we're going to be distinguishing here between sort of rule-based, governed, written down, explicit systems versus the more sort of fluid kind of sociality that you'll see in a chat room, or just in a everything from a dinner party. I think that you're going to be seeing in a chat room, everything is unpredictable. You can't know all the parties. You can't see everything that's going on. Everything will be fluid and it's going to be constantly negotiated. And that's what you see here. You're sort of seeing people defining this, trying to define this as, this is a bull market right now, or this is the bear market.
Unleash the Kraken, and you've got the bulls and the bears.
The Kraken, yes. No, I'm not a trader. I don't trade.
But this is all the marketing that goes around these platforms like Plus 500, and you see all the advertising and you see all the affiliates.
Yeah.
And they're the worst. The shills come out in force, and they're like, yeah, you need to come on this platform, but, you know, because obviously you're going to get 15%, but they don't disclose that to you.
No, and that, you know, that contrasts really, really starkly with how the blockchain works, because that's legible, available, verifiable. And maybe, I mean, that's probably the big shift in this kind of currency compared to also, you know, lots and lots of other schemes that I mean, we've got all the hypers. They've always been there before. If you know John Law, the Scottish swindler who went to France, set up an entire sort of banking currency system based on some very, very speculative stuff in Louisiana. And he was out there hyping it too. He was out there passing it along. People all of a sudden, they got personally invested into it, and they needed everybody else to believe in this project. And, you know, of course, you know, that goes on in the crypto community, goes on in every community. The only difference is it has this silver lining, has this backbone of legible, verifiable code. That's what makes the difference in my perspective.
But only if we have the will.
Yeah, you've got to do it.
Yeah. What is it about us that I think, you know, that wants to think, you know, daddy knows best, and we'll go, you know, we'll have someone to look after our keys for us, and we won't have to worry about that stuff. And one of the issues that's coming up all the time, I get so many startups in the crypto scene, like approaching me, like asking me if I can do that community, like come on the show or maybe do some consulting. And please keep them coming in. I'm not having, I'm about to offer a critique, which is this notion that they want to simplify, like take everything down. And I'm all up for simplification, or at least not making anything more complex than it needs to be, but not simplistic. This is the issue. And we've had this come up before with ChangeTip, who say, look, you know, we can't get there yet. Personal key management is too hard for most users. And as a result, you know, we've got to look after the keys for them. And, you know, this is a hot wallet. And, you know, not to make this personal about ChangeTip, but look at the habits that people have in the space of keeping all their coins on empty GOX and bit, you know, and then as soon as the news comes out, all of a sudden they're too late and they've lost their coins because they did not own the private keys for themselves.
No.
And they didn't have it in their domicility. It wasn't in their jurisdiction. It wasn't under their control.
No. No, they deposited not only their money, but their trust in an organization.
Right.
And that's sort of quite un-Bitcoin-like.
So what's the lesson here? I mean, like, if you're a startup, for example, you're working in the cryptocurrency space, you've got two pressing needs. You've got two urgencies, okay? And remember what an urgency is. It's someone else's emergency. An urgency doesn't become an emergency until it emerges naturally and everyone agrees on it, right? So when you get stuff in your inbox, and I don't recommend you have an inbox, but it says urgent on it, you can pretty much guarantee you don't need to answer that. In fact, most of these urgent emails can be ignored and everything will be fine. And the reason is because the urgency, particularly if you've got an investment from a VC, they're going to start putting all kinds of KPIs on you. They're going to start putting metrics on you. They're going to say you need 1,000 new users a month. But wait a minute, look at what that behavior might get us. What externalities could that produce? If we're out there trying to get 1,000 new users a month, what does that do to the complex set of behaviors in this environment? So for example, with tipping, if you keep tipping people and you keep encouraging them to tip, all of a sudden, I'm forced into a situation where I have to treat my friends like economic agents. I have to be political with my friendships now. Now, yeah, sure, friendship can be a very political thing, and we can form alliances and use one another and you do some tit for tat, but it's very elastic. It's not, you know, a friendship isn't literally me sort of with an abacus going, okay, how much have I given you? And if it starts to become measured and quantified, if I start to have a Bitcoin address and I can see like, okay, I tipped this guy twice already this month, that's enough, you know, because I don't want to have to top the wallet up again, you know. The problem with it is that it leads to all these sort of awkwardnesses. And one of the biggest fears that a customer will have, I nearly called them a user, I hate calling people users, customers have, is social embarrassment. It's worse than death itself. Like Leslie said yesterday, like the reason you fear social embarrassment more is because you actually have to live with the consequences. When you die, you don't have to live with it. So there's a certain equanimity that can come about people, you know, when they're in like a witness to a car accident, or maybe they're involved in some kind of accident, that they can all of a sudden just find themselves with this inner strength. But social embarrassment, my God, no, it's too, all right, what if I spell the word wrong? And then like I tip them and then it doesn't work. And I'm going, oh no, I'm so sorry. It didn't go through. Let me do that again. You know, and these little micro transactions, these little cognitive processes not only are bigger in the mind than they are in the material world, but also once you add up all these social anxieties, these little anxieties, it adds up to a whole bunch of customers saying no, and I'm not even going to tell you why. And then you have an awkward meeting with the VC and he says, well, you're not hitting your targets and we agreed that you weren't getting the next round of funding. And we weren't going to get our friends to invest in you until you reach these metrics. And no one bothers to ask why the metrics aren't working. Everyone says what, no one asks like why. Maybe we got something wrong. Maybe the goal here isn't to get Bitcoin into the mainstream, but to get Bitcoin understood.
I mean, it's very, very, very difficult to go into a different market or go into a social situation and figure out what's happening here. What are the relevant parameters? In anthropology and every other field that I've been a student of, and I'm still a student, we bicker about this endlessly.
Right.
It is very, very, very hard to go about it. You see it also with standard testing. You see it in all these markets. It's, because it causes a reflexive effect. You put the rule up, and it's not like the rule is outside of the system looking in, judging it retrospectively. No, you're going to have people reflexively trying to meet these targets on their own. Instead of measuring academic excellence, you strive to pass the test that measures academic excellence.
Yeah.
And I could very easily imagine that going on with KPIs. And it's just, is it unique to the startup scene? Probably not, but it's probably very acute there because you have a very undefined business model.
It's common in governments. I mean, look at the way the British Labour government back in the late 90s, early 2000s were setting targets for hospitals. And they were doing things like get the waiting list down. And do you know what that leads to? A whole bunch of people being kicked off the waiting list because it's not economical for them to do it anymore. Same with schools. The schools started getting graded based on the students' grades. So what do? Just before the exam start, they expel all the bad students. And it's like, you're not thinking about, it's not even about social costs or any of that left-wing stuff that you often hear. It's actually about the long term and the short term. All you're doing is kicking a can down the road for someone else to sweep up. And then the trick, as Vitalik beautifully, this guy, Vitalik Buterin, Ethereum, I pulled up a screen grab just earlier on of Stefan, who's one of their community people there, and he's had a lot of trolling. He's had a really hard time. He does not deserve it. He's a good person, good human being. But Vitalik Buterin talks all the time about game theory, about the fact is that you want to reach something like the Nash equilibrium where when I act in my benefit, it is in the benefit of everyone else at the same time, because otherwise you will always act in self-interest. Why? Because if you don't have the self, and if you don't have the self, you don't have a network. Right.
Well, I mean, I think this problem is so universal that there's really no way around it. You see every new management movement tries to solve this problem in new ways. I think in Scandinavia, we're talking in Copenhagen right now, there's been a major discussion about new public management and what kind of targeting, what kind of quality measures do we need in the public sector? Because I mean, obviously there need to be some kind of standards to measure what's going on, but nobody can seem to agree on what the relevant measures are. And it's sort of a moving target because once you start measuring it, then people work to measure. And so you need to update this constantly. And I think that the only way to do this in a rational way, so to say, is to sort of step back and realize, okay, this is the limit of our rationality. We're not going to be able to plan this out in advance. And then let some kind of market force, whether it's like in a full commercial market or a quasi market within a state, just try to see if you can't let that happen. I think that would be my guess as to how best to do this. Like school vouchers, for instance, you're going to be allowing lots of different value sets, lots of different bases to understand what a good school is. So you're going to have like competing sets of KPIs from different parent groups, and maybe that's sort of a less knowledge heavy way of doing it. That way you don't need to exactly know what is the best school for all situations. Why
this top-down paternalism at all? Like we were getting trolled earlier by Juicy Grabs on Twitter, and he was like, I think what he wants to do is get me to say that I'm a statist, so that he's got somebody he can retweet and tell everyone, oh, I knew he was a statist. But the thing is, like, why are you using this kind of political like terminology? What is it about these? Like, my goal is I want to be called a statist and a libertarian in the same week. That's my goal in life. You know why? Because if people have to keep guessing what I am, I'm doing my job properly. It means I'm not fixed. I'm not certain. I'm still learning. I don't know what you mean when you say this, but one thing I've learned in life is that people will tell you what you are. They will always come to you with the labels, and what they're doing is they're intellectually lazy. Yeah, they don't want to have to think, and so when they can just slap a label on you, you're done. Like, that's it. You're ANCOM and you're ANCAT, and you just pick your hyphen, right?
Yeah.
And you just go through it, and it just means that you can go. And what it does, I think, is it gives them license to pick fights. So this is one of the things that people need to understand about trolling. That's the topic that I see emerging from this conversation, is that it is your responsibility to walk away. Have you seen that little meme on the internet where it's like the doll and it says like, show me on this doll where the internet hurt you? You know, the thing is, it gives you the forest. The internet is terrible. The internet is a forest, and it is a place where you can run away and you don't have to feel like you've been, physically hurt. You can have a discourse with someone. You can go into it with an open mind. Instead of going into the conversation with your mind made up, like, I know what statism means and I know what libertarian means, and I'm going to go into this conversation with these preconceived notions, and my goal is to convince you that I'm right. And if not, then we can have a good old argument and I can be right again because I can make you look silly, And it's like the best thing to do as soon as you notice someone behaving like this towards you is just walk away. It's your responsibility. You can just choose to ignore them, because what they do is they feast on your time, right? That's time in your life that you're never getting back. Now, back to the startups, and believe me, this is all going to weave back together, okay? So I just showed some screen grabs of two of the most exciting startups in this space, in my opinion, okay? You've got one name here, which is both of these sites that I'm going to show you are identity consolidation services, or social kind of like identity services. It's a bit like about.me, which has been around for a long time, okay? And what it allows you to do, let's pick a Vitalik. What it does is it allows you to make a claim in a social object on the internet that this is me, so this is an entity identifying themselves as Vitalik Buterin with a picture of Vitalik Buterin. Now, so far, anyone could have done this. It's just a claim. But then after a while, you can add some proof. So look, we click on the proof here. And now it takes us to verify myself, one name Vitalik. This is Vitalik Buterin's account, and hey presto. But what if someone hijacked his account? Well, okay, we've got another factor of authentication, which in this case is a text file on Vitalik's GitHub. And I can click on that, V Buterin, and I can see, well, I can't, he hasn't written any other text files, but if he did, oh, there we go, we've got his GitHub there. There we go, and I can see that this, look at all this activity, right? So it cannot be a coincidence that all of these different things have come together. Not to discriminate, of course, against Keybase, which take a similar approach, except they put more emphasis on PGP. They also, by the way, another interesting distinction is that one name puts stuff into Namecoin's blockchain, which I really like because it doesn't plug up the Bitcoin blockchain. And remember that Namecoin is merge mined with Bitcoin. So you still get the security, or pretty much most of the security benefits of Bitcoin, but it doesn't plug up the ledger. And then, and then you've got Keybase. This is Tom Morris. He used to work at Wikipedia as a friend of mine. And you've got his Bitcoin address, and he's validating his website. So we can click on the HTTP proof, and then that shows you a text file that comes. So the reason this is highlighted, I'll talk about in a couple of weeks. I'm working on a new app at the moment, which detects Bitcoin addresses on the page. I'll talk more about that in due course. So this is one of the interesting things, is that what it gives rise to is this kind of, I always say that like time itself is such an important concept that people just cannot get their heads around. People tend to think of time on as a line, like a history, but you have to remember that that's what you're doing. You're projecting that line out. The time actually is a center is a movement away from a center. Like the time is always now. Like you bring your future to a past memory, and you weave a present moment from that. Right? You want to have a future. You want to bring it into the present. You check the manual, you check the history book, and then you use that as justification for bringing things into the present. You look at pictures of the recent conflict in Gaza and Israel, and one of the best pictures that you get when photojournalists take a picture of one person holding up a Quran and the other person holding up a land deed registry or some kind, like, no, our God told us that we own this, that we're entitled to it. No, I think you're fine if you check the blockchain. But our blockchain says something else. And this is one of the questions that's coming up in the Bitcoin space, is that we do have this objective record, not just an objective record, but an objective record that resides in your locality, which is, impossible for a government to come around to every single person's house and stop you from having access to the internet at all. They can't have it both ways. The state can't be God. because it's subject to the whims of nature just the same way that we are.
And information costs and transaction costs and the actual cost of hiring people to go do maps and maintain databases and so on and so on. Yeah, I mean, enormous cost goes into maintaining a blockchain, but from a sort of a information distribution system as such, it's very, very unusual. I'm putting my pith helmet and anthropology outfit on.
Right.
This is very, very, I mean, I wouldn't say strange, because it does, it does tie very well into sort of past developments, but it's unusual to have it in that structure. I think for, if we look at those identity providers, there's a lot of demand, as I see it, for fixture on the internet of some kind of, rebelling against the fluidity of all of it. If you don't call Marx, I'm not a Marxist. No. Now I can just imagine people calling me a Marxist.
Yeah, we're going to get a whole lot of trolls now.
And but he wrote about modernity, saying in the Communist Manifesto that all that is solid melts into air. And people have this sense on the internet of this happening, because you could be anonymous. There's no structures, websites crashing, going down, whatever. Everything was flowing around. Blockchain fixes things. It locks it. It produces a lasting registry or lasting record that can't be easily manipulated. These identity providers here, they make you not just a random name, they make you a person. They gather up these different narrative, biographical threads and gathers you into a person. Yeah. If you think of, I think, like for me, the most vastly overrated internet phenomenon that happened in my lifetime was Second Life. Second Life was an attempt to make an alternative and far too plastic reality. People don't want to.
It was too clever. It was trying to be too clever.
Yeah, too clever. It was World of Warcraft, except for life. It was sort of straddling a very uncomfortable border between real life and the World of Warcraft. And think of like dating apps, dating websites, where you could be totally anonymous. You could be anybody. Your pictures could be a stock photo. Mine certainly are. But I mean, you can, that doesn't work. People don't like those. They're unpopular. Tinder was popular because Tinder ties you into a more stable, verifiable public identity. You're Facebook. With Facebook today, at least in Denmark, we have like 86% Facebook penetration. Your Facebook is probably more verifiable than the phone book. So there's a demand. There's a demand for fixity. Oh yeah, constantly. And because people, you're going to have, let's say somebody adds you on Facebook, you're going to check, do I actually have some friends in common with this person? Can I verify that this is a real person and not just some sort of fraudster? There are movements. The internet is such a terrible thing. We need to just stop using the term the internet, because there's so many things.
So what would you?
I would just sort of say, just bracket the whole thing. Just put it into the background. Say, rather than saying, well, on the internet, people talk about these and these and these things. How about just saying, people talk about these and these things, because there's so many different things going on there. It's just not a place. But I mean, going back to the fixity thing, and the forest and civilization theme, there's a lot of struggle on the internet. Do we want to be a public, governed, knowable space, or do we want to be a fluid, anonymous subspace, like a side space to the main social forums? Do we want to be that, or do we want to be in the mainstream? And they require different kinds of governance, and that's, I think, one of the interesting things about Bitcoin.
But doesn't it subsume us? Like, isn't the internet like a liquid, like a gas? Like it's everywhere. It's pervasive. Like I'm only ever one decision away from being on the internet.
Yeah. It's constantly there.
It's constantly there, and it helps us navigate the world. No? It helps us like determine what we really care about. Like this whole, I've been studying the internet for a long time, and I'm looking back at some of the early writings in the '60s. Of people like Erik K. Dick and Philip K. Dick, sorry, and people like this and McLuhan and all this kind of visualization. So I'm looking at a tweet that someone tweeted out earlier on, and I was thinking, what is it about? Yeah, it's sort of like a social thing. It's like the internet is everywhere. I have to fiddle around. I have to get stuff lined up for the screen sharing so I can show you guys. And one of the things is this sort of self-stabilization. It's almost like we're trying to stop the future escaping. Like nature, like as Aristotle, has this insight, the physis is that which moves upon its own momentum. Yeah. And then the psyche, and in Dionne talks about the soul as a kind of a regulating force that stems the flow of nature, that brings it back, that makes it witnessed and then makes it permanent. Now, remember that what came up in the Bitcoin white paper, and one of my favorite things to do is to go through the white paper with people that are willing and that know about it already and are interested to learn more. And this is a story all about publishing, that really what Satoshi is trying to do ostensibly, it's a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, but he'll never mention the word cash again.
No.
From now on, it's all going to be about publishing, And I know I keep saying this, but for anyone who's new to this network and new to my show and my sort of process of learning, messages are broadcast on a best effort basis on this peer-to-peer network, that nodes can leave and rejoin the network at will, accepting the longest proof of work chain as proof of what happened whilst they were gone. In other words, that publish quickly, publish broadly. And once you have more than, I don't know, 3 or 4 witnesses, and they can all persist that in time and have independent, simultaneous memory of it, now it's fixed. Now it's ice. Now you've cooled the gas, it's become a liquid, and then once you get one confirmation, it's past the first past the post system. You're not going to change it now. It's past the event horizon, as it were, right?
Yeah.
So what this does, he says, is it brings about a single history. And this is sort of lower down. I'm quite far away from the screen. I can't see it. But somewhere in here, you'll have, transactions that are computationally impractical reverse would protect sellers from fraud. And the routine escrow mechanisms could easily be implemented to protect buyers. So he's now going to segue into what he calls a distributed timestamp server. This was the original name of Bitcoin. Essentially, we're agreeing on action at a distance over time.
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing. And the way we can be sure that events really took place and that someone hasn't lied about the origin, that someone hasn't lied about what they first witnessed, is independent simultaneity. That simultaneously you could go to these bunch of actors on the internet and they will all tell you the same thing. Now, what this leads to is this kind of ephemeral lack of accountability on the net, where people do these sort of drive-by trollings, where they come in, they drop a bomb, and then they leave to satisfy some internal desire. And this sort of, it's not quite psychopathic, I don't want to overdo things, but like antisocial behavior based on a selfish desire, I claim, is because they're not there with the other person. They don't see the direct cause and effect. They're behind a screen. They can close the screen, go to the bathroom, come, they don't have to witness what the results of their actions, and they can untether themselves. And this is one of the things that's coming up at the Silk Road trial, why they're going after Silk Road and not the numerous other scams that were, no one's made a complaint about the Silk Road. No one actually said like, I've got a problem with this website, I'm getting all these drug dealers and everything. No, it took violence away. It actually, a young hacker did what the government probably should have been doing, if we agree with the premise the government should exist in the first place, and he did a better job. And they were embarrassed. And no one complained, but instead what they decided to do was disagree with him ideologically. They got pissed off. Don't compete with the government. It really, really shows them up. And now they can't turn around to the hoi polloi and the majority and say, look, it's all about appearances. How will this appear to someone else? And if I'm a government, my main objective is to stay in power. Right?
Well, at least to appear to be sovereign.
Yeah,
it's well, like I said, even things like we said before, even things that seem to be taken absolutely for granted, they take a lot of work to maintain. Sovereignty is not just a state of affairs that exists. It's not just a legal document saying that we are the government, we can do this and this and that. It every single day. It needs to be produced, needs to be maintained. Their flags need to be waved. Papers need to be signed. Protocol needs to be observed. It doesn't just, that's maybe one of the key insights, I think, of modern anthropology, is that I think back in the day, when people first went out, they went out to just sort of discover the underlying social logic. Like, we had this idea perhaps that there was that if societies were organisms, we would go out and find the bones or even the DNA. It's not like that. We figured out it's much more like a dinner party of people trying to maintain and create and jostle for, they have agendas, but they're all basically trying to stay within sort of a bandwidth of acceptable behavior. And this takes a lot of effort and work, and governments do this all the time. They'll shut down things that really are not socially damaging in any particular way, but that sort of diminish their claim to be the sovereign, undisputed leader or something. And some things the governments shut down, some alternative governance structures or alternative violence or justice structures that they shut down, like biker gangs, are probably ought to be put down. But other things they'll shut down are only really shut down because of the symbolic challenge that they make up.
surely it would be much better if we could develop a civilization where we could self-correct and self-stabilize, self-regulate from internally. And this is the problem with protocol, is that protocol, you could take it, I interpret it to mean something like before the meeting, right? Before we get here, what do we do before? Because once you're locked into that kind of pre-ontological definitions of rules, you've got no way out, right? Because they're already predefined. So for example, we were talking yesterday, Facebook. When you sign up to Facebook for the first time, it demands that you to know whether or not you're male or female. It's a binary choice. But if you don't identify with either of those two, then you've got to log in, like get a whole account set up and then go and choose one of the hundreds and hundreds of different options. And we noticed that when you go to your profile and change your gender, if you want to nuance it, it mixes up sexuality and gender and all these different terms. And it says, how do you want to be addressed, as him, her, or they, or their? And it's got all these different pronouns, and it's all very like, it's almost like you're baking your ethics into the physics of the environment. Yeah,
and it's also built atop. I mean, quite obviously, they have the base structure, which is one or the other, and then on top of that, they put sort of a veneer of inclusiveness. But it's not, of course, it's not built into the way that Facebook is structured. You're probably going to still be marked as one or the other, no matter which one. What you like.
It strikes me that this is very much a kind of state-like behavior. The state, literally, in physics means state. If something is stateful, if it has the ability to persist some information that we can remember, that we can recall later on, right? So I've got all my sheeple, I've got all my citizenry. Sorry, I've got all my citizenry. As I'm a government, I'm a state, okay? I'm like big Leviathan, and I'm just looking down on everyone, yes. And I'm going through the people, okay, you male or female? Yeah. You can be other things too, but just tell us. Just no. I know.
I know, but still.
but just tell us one way or the other. Because the thing is, we've got these investors on the stock market, and they need this data to be meaningful in some way, right? and we need to sell this on to advertisers, and advertisers can't deal with complexity. You need to boil this down for us. Define who you are, just like Juicy Growser. Define who you are. Give me a category. And then once we've dealt with that, we can deal with you in the appropriate way. And this is this kind of tyrannical, like government state, like we just can't deal with fluidity. We can't deal with changeability. No. And I think that we're about to see a young generation emerge that take up technology like a fish to water, like a bird to air, and they just pick up these devices. And I've done a little bit of teaching with kids before, show them how technology works and how to learn it from the ground up. So a lot of young people now, they just learn how to use interfaces. And they don't learn how to use, what machine code is. They don't know how circuit boards work. And I encourage them, take things apart, be curious, learn for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Well, they're like, how do I know, Chris? How do I know that you're not giving us a thing? Well, can you imagine a world where what I'm telling you is true, but I don't exist? Can you conceive of a world where the information I'm giving you could be true in absence of a whole plethora of a number of other things? Now, go out with that information and test it for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Get someone else. Find someone who vehemently disagrees with me. Find someone who disagrees with me a little bit. Find someone who seems to agree with me all the time, and test the assumption and keep testing and don't ever assume like what, and this is, I think this is where philosophically we went wrong. Like Descartes defines the beginning of modern philosophy as we know it because of the cogito, because he says the only thing I can be sure of is that I am a thinking thing, that I have a thought, and so long as I have a thought, that even if it's a dream, it doesn't matter so long as I am dreaming, right? So in order to be alive, in order to be conscious, is to be in a dream, as it were, right? It affords that phenomena. Does that make sense?
It doesn't allow for
it. It allows for imagination in the first place.
It does, yeah.
So it wouldn't. I don't think Descartes, particularly like when Heidegger, came along much later on. He's like, well, look, David Beckham doesn't have to believe in the football before he kicks it. He just kicks the damn thing. He just, we constantly go out in and out of this conscious, unconscious behavior, reflexive. I use the device like it's second behavior, like it's normal behavior, and then I turn and I become more conscious.
I think it's misleading to imagine people sort of generally being Cartesian subjects. I'm sure that we can. That is a cognitive thing that we can do. We can definitely observe ourselves from the outside. It's a skill that we can do. It's a skill we can develop. We do develop it when we're writing biographies and so on, viewing ourselves from the outside, or viewing ourselves as sort of disappearing into ourselves and looking out. But no, that's not. I don't think that's the default setting. I don't think that's the factory setting.
Right.
That's it's not. It's deeply misleading. We can do it, absolutely. We should do it for all sorts of things, but no, it's not the default setting. I think phenomenologists God, it took me a long time to learn how to say phenomenology.
Phenomenology, yeah.
Well, they
just say what you see.
Yeah. Well, I think they just build a more realistic foundation for describing human actions, which is the fact that you're already among things. You're always already among things, and
you can't escape that.
Yeah, and that's quite fixed. It's that is again quite fixed, and you're sort of brushing up against some hard structures in a way that I don't think that Descartes really allows for, or at least that he doesn't imply, and it comes secondarily to thought. Exactly. Brushing up against hard structures is sort of meeting it, being sort of like this fluid, imagining yourself sort of a fluid intellectual wave, but at some point you're going to crash against some rocks. That I think is, I don't think people should spend all too much time on Heidegger, but if you do read phenomenology, that is the takeaway. That is the TLDR.
Good word.
And but I mean, so for trolls, if we go back to them and to the internet, sort of the social structures that we see, that I see, imagine at least, is there's a not a battle, but there's two radically different styles of socializing that are going on. One is about verifiability and publicity and fixedness and rigidity, establishing that, and the other is about fluidity and hiddenness and anonymity. And of course, there are institutions in place to reconcile these and to allow for both kinds of behavior. A lot of them are sort of weird, like transmission boxes. They'll be putting like some degree of, like, let's say they'll be linking anonymous users who have single-use identities that they can throw away afterwards, but then they build an organizational structure that'll connect them to real-life identities.
Graph theory and so on.
Well, Silk Road was one of those organizations, linking up hard structures through, like, the medium of the internet, through, like, under the veneer of this anonymity, under this fluidity. And I think that many of the institutions that are built on the internet have that role. They're not gatekeepers as much as they're sort of transmission boxes, gateways, routers.
Is it something to do with this sort of negotiation between what I can remember and the facts and the reality? So there's what I remember, and then I check it. So, like, I'll be completely convinced of something, for example, that I learned because I have a memory of learning this thing, and then I'll go back and I'll check the original text, and it's like, this doesn't match what I remember. And why is that? I was so sure. And it's because of subjectivity. I can't get outside of my perceptions. I can't get outside of my filters. And all you can do is just be conscious of that, I think. And that's what I try to do with young people, is I try to help them to be confident, independent thinkers. Like, you do not take anything I take for granted. Like, one of the common things you can do to one of the best things you can help with as a young child is say, right, put up your hands as high as you can, and they do this, and it's a little bit higher. Oh, and then every child in the class would just stop. Oh, you said as high as I can, and then I didn't realize I could do it even higher. And it's this notion of, like, my ability to understand myself in terms of my potential, now the Heideggerian language, sorry, is limited by my perceptions and my beliefs and my self-doubts, acrasia, this self-sabotaging agency that I think pervades all of us, like miners who keep mining even though it's not profitable for a long time. And then you get these long, drawn-out periods of bad decision-making, actors coming in from the outside, reflecting on that and saying, you're making a bad decision, actors on the inside saying, no, we've got sunk costs, we can't admit it to ourselves. Because in order to, as Sartre says, in order to be in denial, you have to know what the truth is. That denial itself is knowledge of truth, but is actually working against truth. Right? You have the sentinel, his idea of the sentinel, and you navigate between the conscious and the unconscious. And that to be in denial is hard work, because we always have to keep denying to ourselves that truth that keeps lurking behind us like a monster, like, I'm going to get you, I'm going to tell you, no, I'm not ready for this yet. I've still got to do this tweet, and I've still got to spend all day on Facebook and not do any work, and all of these sorts of bad habits. Now, yesterday you said something really interesting. This is perhaps something that we can sort of start to wind down on, because we've got some questions I want to go to. You talked about Bitcoin as an abacus. Yes. Say more about that.
Well, it really ties into memory. What we got into is, if as an anthropologist or a social historian or whatever sort of squishy science that you're into, you put on the huge macro glasses. You step back from sort of shopping and point of sale solutions and all this sort of very granular stuff. You look at the big line. So you consider, well, what do financial systems do? What do monetary systems do? And from our point of view, I'd say, of course I can't speak on behalf of all social science students, but to me it looks like a coordination system. It looks like a system, like a big, huge tally. And I know that other people in the Bitcoin community have talked about tally sticks.
Yes. Chris Cook as well.
Yes, he talks a lot about that. I think that actually a better image is an abacus, or even I was thinking about this on my way over here. There's a system used by the Incas called the quipu. And the quipu is it's sort of like a big string octopus. It's a bundle of red cords, red and brown ochre colored cords.
How do you spell it?
KHIPU.
Okay.
And it's on this system.
Oh yes.
You use it as an accounting system. Yeah. You draw you make little knots. If that's on screen, you tie knots into it, and then you interpret these, and you use them as a tally stick or as a tool of reckoning to figure out usually to keep track of payments,
right? Payments
and debts. And abacuses do this too. There are all sorts of tools that do this, and the function of it is super simple. We are limited beings with very plastic memories. We can convince ourselves of almost anything. Yeah. And our hard drives are made of meat.
Yes.
And this means that we need some kind of external fixture. We need codification and quantification. And it seems quite obvious if we look at the record that these systems predate writing by quite some time. I mean, hundreds of years they predate writing. I was talking about cuneiform. We have the first accounting tools are in proto-cuneiform. So they're even older than cuneiform. Cuneiform built on top of these kind of record-keeping systems. And they are the first money. Circulating media of exchange, coins and tokens only came much, much later. And so in some sense, Bitcoin is sort of even if it's technically built in a radically different way, it's sort of bringing us full circle to this. I know that people use the cash metaphor a lot, and Satoshi Nakamoto uses the cash metaphor, but I think the cash metaphor is wrong. Bitcoin is not; they are not tokens, individual tokens. They're infinitely divisible. It's not that they have a paper trail; they are a paper trail. They are like the little beads in the abacus. It's sort of an abacus being woven in one end and being fixed in the other, and that's a very, very different kind of system, and that's a record-keeping system. It's a system for quantifying and storing debts and social obligations, and that's also what we're seeing the alternative applications for the blockchain technology. People are talking about land registries, cadasters, I guess they're called, and talking about Namecoin, domains, and so on and so on. These are exactly the kind of cases where you want to be very, very, very particular about who owes what when. And I know that, for instance, Brett Scott probably, if I'm not misrepresenting his views, and other sort of critics of Bitcoin, the Bitcoin economy, this memory is also part of the politics of Bitcoin, I guess. Yeah. Because there's no jubilees in Bitcoin. There's no forgetting. Yes. There's no way of denying, of changing your name and moving to another state.
Wow. Well, yes.
It's so fixed. It's fixed. It's a rigid social system.
It's actually worse than a state.
Oh, much worse. There's no way there is really no way. Once your funds have passed hand, once this has been registered and is out there in millions of copies, there's no negotiating with it.
So talk a bit about Brett. What would you want to say?
Just that I think that I've discussed this, that he's mentioned this a little bit before about the politics of Bitcoin and the very unequal distribution of Bitcoins out there, Gini coefficients and all this. Right. And I don't really have any take on that, but it is, of course, having eternal non-negotiable memory of all transactions and debts and obligations is not a politically neutral state of affairs.
Well, this is Eric, what's his name? Eric Schmidt, my God. Carl Schmitt's notion that a sovereign is that which defines the urgency.
Yeah, the exceptions.
Yeah. And so, but the blockchain, I mean, you can, one of the problems with it, of course, is that which blockchain do you accept as good? So even if we accept, so Vitalik's claim is that with Ethereum, you're going to have this distributed computing model that's like Bitcoin's, but better, he claims, because it's going to be able to do more than what the blockchain can do. Now, we may disagree or we may not, because we may want to make claims about dumber technology being better than smarter technology because it gets too complex too early.
Like sporks.
Yeah, well, it's mainly to do with the fact that we often use technology as an excuse for human failing. So, oh, I'm sorry, I haven't paid the invoice. It must have got caught up in the spam filter. That's the only time like emails ever get caught up in spam filters is when you owe someone money. And it's this excuse that you get all the time, but we like to blame things. Kant has this great insight and critique of pure reason where I'll have to channel him, but it's something like, when my car breaks down, I don't say, oh no, the laws of physics must have stopped working now. I assume that something mechanical has fallen down, something macro has fallen down. And because there must have been a human failure, even as children, I don't think, as babies, and I can remember that far, but I don't remember assuming that the universe was wrong. I came into the world being surrounded by tools, surrounded by meanings. I've got to pick all these things up. So the dead are like treating me like an absolute slave at the moment. They're telling me, oh, you've got to use this. But why? Why do I have to use the letter K when actually it's a K sound? And we got a letter C, and that's perfectly good enough. I could never get around this as a kid. So Vitalik Buterin wants to make a claim, something like, if you have this distributed computing network that you and I can enter into an agreement, and once we set the parameters of that agreement, we can then leave it to the forces of nature itself, namely that we can put some code in there, that a miner, a random person around the world can then pick up this code and execute it at time 2, right? So at time 1, we enter into an agreement that we want to lock us into a particular arrangement. So for example, I mean, you can do this on the Bitcoin blockchain, but just as an example, on this such and such a date, spend these 10 Bitcoins in my account to my estate, send them to my children, right? And don't give me an option out, right? Make it so that even if I really, really, really don't want to, make me do the thing that I'm now saying I want to be done. And so it's sort of a preminal kind of, no, that's not even a word, a precondition from post hoc. So you're actually channeling backwards in time, forwards in time.
Well, since we've been talking about the classics, that's Odysseus tying himself to the mast.
Right. Yeah. From the Odyssey.
Odyssey. That's a self. Ulysses, his name is in English. It's a technology of self-discipline.
Right, because of the siren, and she was going to seduce him.
You don't want to be lured, so you put these bonds on yourself.
That requires a self-understanding. But I'm interested in what happens, because like Suzanne Templehoff, she went to Ghana to try and do some land eating and stuff on the blockchain. I'm like, well, look, sure, you can make a JSON file of the land deeds, and you can scan them in and take a hash of that and put that in the blockchain. But what is it that transitions the state? How do you get everyone to honor that agreement? It's all very well saying it's in the blockchain, but what if someone comes along with a gun and says, I don't give a fuck about your blockchain?
That's wrong.
Or that's wrong, What if the original claim was wrong? And I think very naively, we just think that recording stuff permanently will somehow help us make agreements a lot better.
Well, I think that's very important. We need to understand what is the nature of the beast. I think that it would be, I shouldn't really lecture to the people that I'm trying to learn from, but I think one of the insights that I brought out is that these systems are not self-executing. They're not self-embedding. They don't just insert, they don't just arise and then diffuse like by water, spreading naturally into social systems. This needs to be engineered quite a lot. And if you just go to a place and just make a land deed registry of them, people aren't going to know that. They're not going to know about it. So I don't know. There's no easy way to do that. And I think that fixing something that you can't alter has its own problems. There's a reason people use Etch-a-Sketches. There's a reason people want to be able. This is a major advantage of, let's say, word processors over typewriters.
Right.
I think that's fine if you understand that the blockchain technology is this fixing thing. It is like the ultimate laminator. It is casting them. It is fixing them in space. But that's a different tool. That's not the same tool as you would use for everything else. Many databases, as we talked about yesterday, they're updatable. Blockchain is not updatable. But you'd have to you could make a message. You could broadcast a message to well, actually, the agreement that we entered into 15 blocks ago was actually mistaken, and now this is the real one, and here is my public code.
There is no command said on the blockchain. You cannot undo.
Exactly.
But doesn't that give way to a kind of awareness of the interstitial period, the before we commit to things, that we now have to think more carefully? And isn't that a good thing?
Well, it is a good thing, but it also, sometimes you want to opt out. I mean, sometimes it's, I think that commitment strategies have their place. People use them for all sorts of important, socially important things. I mean, people sign mortgage agreements. But
even those, we get bailouts.
Even exactly. People go to, like, okay, this is a terrible example because it's slightly negative, but people get tattoos. Prison tattoos or gang tattoos or religious tattoos. These tattoos they're not non-reversible, but they're difficult to reverse. And they mark you permanently. They mark a certain affiliation. They mark you. They fix you, as opposed to being sort of an uninscribed body, a neutral body that could go anywhere. You fix it, you stamp it, and then you tie it to a particular social context. And that is a technology that we've developed in lots of different kinds of places, and it has its places.
But it's subject to the distribution. Because once you start to distribute messages, this is all about publishing. And whereas we had the printing press that got more social strata into publishing, now we have the speed. So now, okay, you can publish something, but whether or not anyone would recognize it, this is what patent law was all about. It was a first past the post system, where the first person to get that patent accepted was the one that was deemed to have this future to past motion, where I get the tattoo and I'm faced with a future where the tattoo is always there. So every moment I am aware of, the tattoo comes at me from a future perspective based on a past into the present decision that I made. Right.
Exactly.
And this is the same thing now with government.
It ties you into a trajectory also.
Yeah, exactly. And it limits our possibilities. It limits the things that we can do, especially with the blockchain, where once I'm limited, if I've only got a certain amount of 5 Bitcoins in this address, it's an equalizing force, like the gun. It's an equalizing force. It gives everyone the same capacities. It doesn't care where blockchain doesn't care where you come from. It doesn't care what color you are, what religion you are, any of that. It basically says, here are the rules. Everyone has to play by the same rules. But the next challenge for us now is almost a challenge of persuasion. I don't like the word. Well, actually, let's use that word, persuasion. Let's call it what it is. That you've got certain marketeers and people that are good rhetoricians, that are good with words. And how do they use those words to inform other people? And why use the blockchain just because I tell you to? And then how do you agree with disagreements? What can we use as the excuse in the event that? Now, people have suggested to me before, well, look, if you have a blockchain where everyone opts in, you have mutually assured destruction, that no one wants to violate the contract, because if they do, what will it mean for their contract? But that still requires this tipping point. This still requires a certain level of adoption until you've decided there's no going back now. Like, the QWERTY keyboard is here to stay, everyone. We're not getting rid of it, right? Because we've all now made even a subconscious. What I'm saying, I guess, is that there is something at a deeper level, a subconscious level, that is driving our decisions and preferences for technology. That these devices, these companies like Google, Facebook, they've given us new habits. They've affected our behavior. They haven't changed the laws of physics, but they've changed the way we've behaved within those.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we call it. There are different terms that we use for this in anthropology and in ethnography, but the two most important ones I would say is embodiment and, well, 3 actually. There's embodiment, and there's inscription, and there is embedding. Embodiment is when you take, well, for instance, you take your phone, and your phone becomes an extension of your body in a very literal sense, and it'll become sort of it blurs the line between you and it. Like, I try to take pictures of the back of my phone because my brain has just sort of figured in, this is this is now
take pictures. There's a back on the phone.
It's just an extension of my eyes. We do this all the time, and it can be very scary, but it's one of the ways that we just sort of bracket things. We just say, okay, that's just a part of my new body now. Inscription is a little bit more violent process, or it's a little bit more in-depth process. That'll be like tattooing, self-discipline, things that actually physically and socially alter you and mark you as belonging to a certain class or a certain social group. And inscribed bodies have enormous advantages in the sense that they tie themselves to it. It shows commitment. And if you're committing on other people's behalf, that's a very tyrannical thing to do. But if you're doing it on your own, it sort of shows some sincerity. And I think maybe perhaps in terms of getting blockchain technologies out there, people have it's sort of skin off their nose. They're committed. They've already spent enormous resources building this.
Sunk costs.
And that, but I mean, actually, sunk costs might seem irrational, but it also demonstrates that I was willing to do this. I put my money in it. I put my foot where my mouth is.
Or your mouth. You put your money where your mouth is.
Yes, I put my money where my mouth is. And that shows commitment, and commitment is important. And that means that other people might not, they have not read the paper. So, but they'll say that, okay, these people who seem serious and seem to be well intentioned, they've done all this, so maybe I can come in. And maybe the third one I mentioned was embeddedness. And blockchains, they exist as distributed, copied ledgers across distributed computer networks. They are not inherently tied into any commercial networks or economic networks or social networks. And there's a lot of work that's going to go into like taking, well, we have this great social structure and we have the existing one. And so how are we going to mesh them? How are we going to tie them in? Same thing with the land deeds that you mentioned in Africa. They're not, I mean, that's not embedded into the local context. You're going to have to perform massive amounts of work to get it in credit card spaces. They call this domestication.
Oh my God.
I think
same way we treat animals now.
Well, I think I just think that they mean that they're trying to get into people's homes.
Yeah, I still think that gives something away.
I know it sounds awful, but that's what they did. It was a huge process. When it started with Diner's card in the 1950s and Visa from the 60s, they had this great idea for technology, for cashless payment system that was the new and bright future. And then they went about building enormous institutions, engaging people who are good rhetoricians, good with words, salesmen, and just trying to
this is
just infiltrate it. Sort of a terrible word.
Stupefaction of the public, the hoi polloi, as Socrates would have liked to have said. And it doesn't treat people like, I want to elevate you up with this information. It's like, I need to keep, a parasite needs the host to exist. It's not even like they're trying to kill you. It's just they want you to stay where you are.
Well, it was driven by people imagining this as being an inevitable part of the future. There's a paper by a guy called David Stern, Staern, who wrote a PhD dissertation about the history of Visa. And it sounds very specific, but for anybody who's interested in payment services and blockchain technology in the future, should read this paper.
Go look it up.
Yes, it's amazing, and it's about cashless society and how that they imagined that this future would become inevitable. So they might as well just go all in on sort of committing to that trajectory and getting people to start using the system. And so they went out, to vendors and merchants and banks and everything. The banks, of course, hated it at first, and they loved it, and then they hated it.
But it strikes me that it's luring people into a commitment.
Well, yeah, it was, and it was a top-down structure. It was a top-down movement, at least. It was the guy who invented the card, who had this vision of it, and a guy called Hawk. And
spelling that?
Hock, who committed to trying to get this embedded into all sorts of commercial networks and so on. It was never user driven because, of course, nobody had ever heard about a credit card.
Well, this is the thing. On some of the most powerful tools that we have, like, for example, the Twitter hashtag, that was a democratic emergence because democratic, in the traditional sense, not in the modern sense of like people just started doing it, and then it emerged, and Twitter noticed it and started employing it officially, right? And as a result, this is the kind of feedback mechanism you need. The problem I have with all this frictionless payment stuff is that you are basically socializing risk. You're forcing a commitment scheme onto a group of people who need an interstitial space, a space of like non-permanence, where maybe I can make a few mistakes, like your family that are willing to forgive you when you do things wrong, your friends that are willing to give you slightly less, and then strangers that are just not willing to forgive you at all. You turn up late to the cinema and everyone assumes it's because you're an arsehole, but actually it was because you were trying to help someone in a car accident. But they always assume the worst in you, and this is why you have friendship, and this is why Hannah Arendt cited her earlier that friendship is political, but love is never political. Love is the only place in life where you have, and this is the problem, is that these frictionless payment systems are robbing us of that interstitial space where we can fail and be okay with that. It's safe. Like, it's a safe place to fail, not fail in a catastrophic sense, but fail in the sense that, you know, I can make a few hiccups and still recover because there's still something important about my existence that needs to be said, that still needs to be out in the open. And by forcing people to commit to these, you know, credit card payments where I can't see what I'm spending, I don't have any visual clues of scarcity. This is the problem. I go into a shop and I can see the scarcity of the products on the shelf, but when I go online, I'm given this illusion that everything is in abundance. I can keep on taking it, that this isn't going to have any downsides later on down the line. And it's ultimately a con. And the reason why, and I know this because I spoke to a friend of mine the other day who runs a website where you can buy Bitcoins. And I was asking him for his advice on how to get credit card integration. He was just like, Chris, you can't buy Bitcoins with credit card. And this is why. It's because the chargeback problem. You've got armies of fraudsters who are set up with industrial sites that all they do, they have banks of phones on the floor, we're ready to do SMS, you know, two-factor out of band authentication. They've got accounts ready. They will just start hitting you straight away. They've got an internal network that's sort of self-stabilizing, like the you know, criminals kind of helping each other out, whatever that's called. And what they'll do is they'll jump on your site, rinse it as much as they can.
Thieves' honor.
Right. Honor amongst thieves, correct. That's it. And what the banks, he said, do is they don't have to take any liability at all because they'll push it all onto you as a merchant. You are expected. So when you get chargebacks, when you get chargebacks, he says that the bank will just wash their hands of it. So the consumer doesn't want to take responsibility. The consumers always expect chargebacks to be there. If someone steals my card, there's no way I'm paying for that. And they expect the banks to do it. And then the banks go to the merchants and say, well, we're not paying for it. So you've got to pay for it. Meanwhile, all this money is getting siphoned off amongst the frauds. And then when I turn up to work as an entrepreneur, as a productive member of, you know, the community or whatever you want to call it, and I want to start, you know, doing stuff, all of a sudden I'm faced with these overheads. And what do? I don't want to pay for it. I cost it into all my pricing. And I put all of the downsides. I estimate the risk as an entrepreneur. I try to anticipate demands of customers. I then put all of my expected costs in and I make the customer pay for it.
Well, I mean, insecurity imposes costs. It just does. You know, the reason that like low-end consumer, like want-to-go loans are expensive, right? Because it's hard to recover them, right? And they have huge failure rates, and that's probably an advantage of blockchain.
That's why they charge.
That's why they have to charge that much.
But they're also hugely profitable. They have been.
They're not actually. They're not hugely profitable over time. Well, I mean, over time in every industry, it'll level out. I don't think that there's. I read a paper from I think it was some American university about it. I'd love to be able to reference this, but I can't. Investigating a lot of pawn shops, a lot of low-end consumer lending, and they don't actually seem to be all that profitable. But they do have enormous rates of this. And the same thing with chargebacks, the same thing with all sort of other financial failings, coordination failings, trust failings. They increase costs, they increase verification costs, and they increase all this and this and that. Maybe that's one of the, I mean, not maybe, that is one of the reasons that Bitcoin is out there, is that it removes some of that interstitiality. It removes, it compresses the transaction time. It gives certainty from the get-go. It means that it means that you're individually responsible for your payments. You can't go to ultra cheap Viagra.com and spend, to your heart's content and expect nothing bad to happen.
This is what the exchanges do, is that they end up taking the liability that ultimately is in your capacity as entrepreneur, that you will face the ultimate liability. And it's up to you to anticipate the risks in the market and the demands of the customer. And like Bitstamp, you've just got to try and best you can price it in. Now, what that leads to, of course, is socialization of risk. But really, it's just a negotiation, because ultimately, you've got insurance industries that then try to, to fight claims that the entrepreneurs make. You've got other social negative externalities, and often people on the poorest incomes will get hit with those because they can defend themselves the least. In fact, the middle classes, I would say, often the lower middle classes can defend themselves the least.
Probably,
because they earn too much to get benefits and the support from the state, but also they're not rich enough that they can defend. They can't.
They're probably not a very strong consumer group. No. I don't know how you would calculate that sort of fraud to wealth.
Well, just above like minimum wage, where you can't afford a lawyer to defend yourself in case, so you rely on your social network, which is fairly fickle. And this was, Machiavelli's point, that if you had to choose between being loved and feared, It's always better to be feared, because fear is a constant, but love is always fickle. You don't always know if you're going to be liked at any one time. And so this notion is that the state almost kind of competes to be the most fearful, the one with the most force, the one that is able to command a territory. Well, this is not
the
Leviathan. Yeah, well, it's not original with me, obviously. I mean, people have said many things like this before, but this idea that, you know, okay, so in my words, I would say, you know, governments exist at edges, they exist at the borders, and they're there to survey a terrain, and they're there to be able to look across the curvature of the earth and to be able to make accurate predictions about behaviors. And they can do that if they enter into this production line of secret sharing, where they're able to share secrets within an in-group and be able to preemptively come in from the future into the present of another human being, intercept them like you've been born. Hello, your name is this, your social security number is this, go into this training camp, I mean a school, and get ready to be put into the factory or the office if you look good enough. You know, and it's, you know, school is all about working out whether or not you're good at learning games or playing games. And if you're too good at learning games, it'll be like, nah, you're either going to get right to the top or you're going to have to be one of those Steve Jobs figures. But if you're good at playing by the rules, the munchkins, you know, in game design, they call it munchkin, someone who plays by the rules. Don't ask questions, just do it. Just play. I've got to put all these people on the train. Where are they going? Don't ask questions. Okay, go on the train, people. Go on the train. You won't need guns, don't worry. Go on the trains, go on the trains. Where are we going? I don't know. I didn't ask.
Are we talking about King's Cross here?
Yeah, we're talking about King's Cross. Put them on the train, and then you've got the exploiters, and these are the tyrants, right? And they march up and down borders, backwards and forwards. They say, "Where are you going?" Well, I'm here to go. Well, I'm here to monitor the transition of the state. Yeah. And you've entered this territory. What territory? That territory. Which territory? This territory. Where does it start? Here. I don't see the line. Yeah, well, get over it. Here's the gun, here's the fucking line. And then they tell you that you've got to comply with these rules. Why should I? Because I've got a gun. Oh, I see that how this works. It's going to keep going around and around in circles. So you comply, partly because of your, you know, I mean, Julia Toransky talks about this in one of her videos, but she says vibrate at the regulated frequency, that you do it by your compliance, by your unquestioning compliance. Because, of course, remember that governments first emerge in response to the mob. The worst type of government, Plato says, because you can't behead many heads. You can behead one head, but it's very, very hard to go back once you've distributed the power structure across all, that it requires a certain level of education and information. Anyway.
Well, I mean, I think you've relatively accurately described how a lot of governance takes place. There's actually going back to James C. Scott and the way that he describes Southeast Asian societies, and actually, to be honest, this is quite a common situation in a lot of strictly governed situations, that you'll have the government favoring one kind of crop, crop which is easier to supervise, which has to be done through organized labor. Typically, stereotypically, it'll be irrigated rice production. Right. This, whether or not this is the most efficient crop to grow there, that's secondary to whether or not this is the crop that is most accessible to various forms of extraction and taxation. So that'll be the typical government situation. You'll be sort of bringing things out into the open where they can be easily assessed and tracked and measured and so on and so on. That is a part of what governing is.
But we can resist that now because we have tools like encryption, where
it's always been resisted, I think.
Yeah.
We talked about yesterday. We talked about potatoes.
Yes,
a wonderful crop. It's like, let's say, like, you know, if you have irrigated rice. I love this. I'm an anthropologist. I like the weird geeky stuff. This is a very, very, very visible crop. It's out there. It's in terraces. You have to organize huge crews and teams to grow this, and it's a fairly good crop, and so on and so on. And you can't leave. I mean, you're stuck. If you put in hundreds and hundreds of thousands of hours of labor into making this, you're stuck, and somebody has an angle on you. Yeah. Whereas there are other forms of income, even for illiterate peasants, that they can access on their own terms. Potatoes and opium and all these other crops that can grow out in the woods, out in the forests, that can be saved safely. That you can burn off your little garden plot, and you'll still have your potatoes underground, hidden. These are historically very, very popular. Governments hate them. They hate potatoes and opium. They hate in West Africa, it'll often be cassava or yams that women can grow, and less powerful people can grow outside of like official cash cropping areas. And I've mentioned and considered Bitcoin to be one of these alternative resources, resource that you can build on your own, that you can hide, that you can use on your own outside of an immediately legible, accessible, taxable, governable space, where you can comply less.
Gives us a forest to run to.
It does give us a forest to run to. It's a zomia, as that zone is called.
Okay.
It's not the only thing going on in the Bitcoin space, but it is one of the things that people use it for, and it's eminently suited for it.
Well, thanks to all the hoi polloi that have been joining us for the last 2 hours in this great discussion with Erik Paisley here. Let's just quickly, before we wrap up, go to some of the Q&A. So we have a John who said that the law was open to all once upon a time, and he sent us the link. I just brought it up just a minute ago.
Yeah.
And this is all about governments making it easier for citizens to know the law. Apparently it's in their interest. I had no idea it was in their interest to know the law. But I've always said that, the best laws are the ones that are most easily understood, no?
Yeah. Who said that? Solon?
I can't remember. I thought I did, but apparently someone said. Yeah, so someone else much smarter than me, much older than me, came along and said that the best laws are most easily understood. So yeah, so that's a cool resource. Thank you for that, John. And moving on. Okay, so this is a John again. Would a minimum tip be acceptable, say $1? I ask because people often make donations to monks. Personal help average is about $3 and normally $10, which is a day's wages in Thailand, which is where a John is from. And the USA is more of a tipping culture, but please comment if you have time.
Well, I love this because we love gift giving and exchanges in anthropology. One of the reasons that we talk about this is awkward, gift giving and tipping in awkward is in the Bitcoin space, is that in the West, social peers do not exchange money.
Yes.
Money basically trickles down. Adults will give children money, parents give their children money, you tip the waiter who is in a not necessarily below you, but in that situation is below you. You give money to beggars and monks, you give money to charities that you want to patronize. The giver has the upper hand. And it's very, very awkward, I think, to define the rules of tipping in the crypto scene, because it's just generally not done among adults.
And strangers, like stranger interaction as a whole.
It's really not done typically. I think the reason it started was because the cryptocurrencies started as novelty items that were essentially free. So you could give them out, like one of my informants described it as a very spy term, but one of my people that I've interviewed and worked with described it how it was just given out as monopoly money. So I think that's where it originated, because it was fun and had no real value. And then all of a sudden it started acquiring a monetary value, and then it became sort of awkward to give it. Sort of it's like,
does this relationship mean nothing to you?
But
once you start applying the syntax, because a lot of the tipper bots started coming out, and they were applying syntax as URIs for the payment. So it would be like, here, have a cake, here, have a coffee. And it's not a real cake or coffee. It's basically a shortcut for monetary value.
But that's better. I mean, we'll give beers, we'll give gifts, we'll bring wine, we do have this whole tit for tat social exchange.
But it's not real.
It's not real, and it's also not monetary. It's sort of disguised behind being a cookie. Or Reddit gold, or Dogecoin. I love Doge,
and
but
the thing is, it doesn't do what
it's a pseudo money.
Yeah, it doesn't do what the internet fundamentally does best, which is de-distance us, bring us closer, not physically in space, but help to give me a teleological or telepresence, right? Help me feel like I am close to someone. Whereas giving someone money does anything but make you feel close.
Well, especially in the West, we have this. For us, money is very, very distance thing. It's anti-intimate. It's public, commercial. Viviana Zelizer, that's with double Z's. She writes about social monies and how because money is sort of inherently dirty and dangerous and public. We do not exchange it in our private lives. You do not.
It's true.
You don't tip your lovers.
No.
So whenever we bring money into our private lives, embed it into our private lives, we need to label it or earmark it or exchange it into a token, an exchange token that is appropriate to an intimate sphere. One of I think it's Bill Moore, who's also an anthropologist. He writes about he had an exchange student from Ghana who came to UCLA and met a nice girl, and they hooked up, and the next day he left her some flowers and his phone number and some money. Oh. And this did not go down well. And there was no ill intent. And this might even be strange in Ghana. Maybe this guy was just extraordinarily naive, but there was literally no ill intent. But that's not done in the West. We need to carefully regulate how money works.
Yeah.
You'll also find that people will be willing to do something for free, but not for a pittance.
Yes, I get this all the time.
Yeah, they'll that's because there's a lot of reasons for it. But receiving money is,
you know what it is. It's like we're settled now. Once you give it the money, it's like we're done.
Yeah, we're done. Yeah, exactly. It's much better to if you want to maintain a relationship, you want to be in a constant state of debt to each other, mutual debt.
Yes.
And yes, settling up is what you do when you leave the restaurant.
Yes.
Exactly. and also when you leave the relationship.
And of course, we should just quickly mention about how tipping can lead to corruption, because corrupt officials lower down in the hierarchy can use it as an excuse. Yeah. So, oh, you want to get across this border? Okay, well, no, but you don't even do that. You know what happens? You get to a border and you say, and if you offer them money, they will get very angry and you will put yourself in danger. What you do is you say, like, well, maybe a tip, maybe I can pay, you look like you're working hard here. Maybe I can give you something for your time. I can see how hard you're working. Oh, well, if it's a tip and the tip becomes an excuse, like, oh, okay, that makes it okay, because otherwise you're calling me corrupt and you better not be calling me corrupt, right? So you've got all these weird things, and I'm sure John can talk about that because he's in Thailand. And so he says also that the government still uses the tally stick. If you don't pay them what they say you owe, they bring out the big stick. Yeah, this is a good point.
Tally sticks were one of the things that they turned around and bit the government in the butt in the UK. Because when the last time Parliament burned, last time the Palace of Westminster burnt, is because they took all these old medieval tally sticks that they had down in the basement, and they decided to burn them as kindlewood, and they're sort of getting rid of the records. No. This is before you had shredders, so they're burning all these tally sticks, and it gets out of hand, and it burns down the heart of government. It's so tax rated.
Oh, that sounds great.
I know. I think it's just. I mean, not even looking at this. I mean, of course, I'm not taking a political stance here, but I do think there's something poetic about the government being burned down by its own tally sticks.
Well, we'll have to do another episode on whether or not politics is the right tool to be using in this age, because I've said often that I don't think it is. So, and our final, I guess it's a comment rather than a question from Melbourne Bitcoin Technology Centre. Thanks for writing in. Who says that the standard of free market competition versus state monopolies. Well, this is it, right? This is the whole point, is that you still got a market with the government. It's just you've only got one player in the market. You've only got one possible.
At least domestically.
Yeah, right. And it doesn't give you choices, and without choices, you can't be free, right? Because you're just locked in. And so absolutely, I don't disagree. And so we'll have to have Vajan on again, who's just quickly wants to say corruption is convenience and all of these kind of things that ease the social interactions day to day. But if you're an underpaid police officer and you see someone speeding, it's just convenient. It's just a case of, well, what do we do in this situation? Or maybe you pay me and I don't have to fill out the paperwork.
I mean, the funny thing is that a lot of these kind of tipping and smoothing the wheels and helping things along would be totally benign if it weren't for the fact that it was inside the government space, where you have laws and taxes funding it and punishments for people who do this incorrectly. A lot of this would, we do this all the time. We offer some beers, we offer some gifts, we bring things. You have a house building and you don't just ask your friends to come and do it because it's their duty. It probably is their duty if they're good friends of yours to come and help you move. But you grease the wheels a bit. And if you do that to a public official, then you're in corruption. Then you're overstepping the bounds, because you're introducing kinds of competition between moneyed and less moneyed citizens that there should not be an auction system for public services, at least not in the standard modern governance ideals. You don't auction off public goods. But of course, in French social life, this is fine to do. There's no problem. There's no problem in this.
Right.
So it's very, very strange. I mean, I don't think that governments are sort of as unique as sometimes people make them out to be, because we're not going to reinvent the wheel for every kind of social interaction that we do. It just introduces this one element of sort of a force and extraction, and it it poisons the water a little bit. It poisons the well. It changes everything. It introduces an unhealthy dynamic to kinds of interaction that would otherwise be fairly benign.
Great. Well, Erik, thanks so much for joining us
No
today.
problem.
That's been really, really good. I hope we can do this again. I'm going to be heading back to London the next few days, but just time for me to say thank you very much for joining us. Do follow us at WorldCryptoNet on Twitter. You can also follow Erik, actually, on Twitter. This is his Twitter page right here that I'm bringing up. So do give him a follow, and of course you can follow me at Mr. Chris Ellis. Thanks very much for your time, and we'll see you later.